After winning his historic election victory last week, Boris Johnson said he wanted to heal the nation. And in the House of Commons, he presented his Brexit bill as a step towards that.
Now is the time to act together as one reinvigorated nation, one united kingdom, filled with renewed confidence in our national destiny and determined at last to take advantage of the opportunities that now lie before us.
But despite the sweet talking, Johnson had stripped away many of the sweeteners Theresa May had added to help MPs support it before the election. That raised passions from the opposition.
There's things that have vanished. It's not only workers' rights that are being downgraded here. It's parliamentarians' rights, because the ability of the legislature to scrutinise the executive has been taken away here. It's bad for democracy.
Outgoing Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, still licking his wounds after a humiliating defeat, drew attention instead to what he saw as Brexit's damaging implications for ordinary people.
This deal will be used as a battering ram to drive us down the path of yet more deregulation and towards a toxic deal with Donald Trump.
He didn't draw attention to a surprise in Johnson's bill, which will limit the negotiating time to just 12 months. Critics argue it'll give the Prime Minister less room to manoeuvre in talks. Johnson says it'll speed things up.
It ensures that we depart from the EU on the 31st of January, and at that point Brexit will be done. It will be over.
Johnson's mantra during the election was "Get Brexit done." But it's unlikely that the argument over Britain's place in Europe will end with this bill.
No alignment on EU rules, but instead...
DW correspondent Barbara Weisel joins us from outside Parliament in London. Good to see you, Barbara. Does this result mean that Brexit is now finally a done deal?
It's not a done deal, of course. We heard that, but it is really on the way. It will happen. Formally, Britain will leave the European Union on the 31st of January of next year. There is simply nothing anymore that can impede that. No opposition. It lies in tatters. The protest movement here is equally completely sort of down and out because people are shocked and they don't feel the strength anymore to stand up. There were not even any protesters anymore today during this vote in front of Parliament who had been so vocal in the months before. So all this really seems to be over for the time being. But we know that in February, the negotiations with the European Union will have to begin about the future relationship. And then, of course, everything will start again. There will be a new fight about what kind of relationship that will be. Boris Johnson has made it quite clear, as we heard, that he wants to really not align with the European Union. So what does that mean? There are further bitter battles up the road.
Well, stay with us, Barbara, as we take a closer look at the withdrawal agreement behind this legislation, which, as you know, has been 3.5 years in the making.
The divorce deal settles the divisions of assets and liabilities. It also guarantees the rights of EU citizens living in Britain and UK citizens in EU countries, and finally sets out the future for the vexed Irish border dilemma. That proved to be the main sticking point in negotiations: how to handle trade along the Northern Ireland border between the UK and EU member Ireland. The proposed backstop arrangement was removed in favour of a solution whereby Northern Ireland will maintain free movement of goods across the border. Avoiding a hard border with customs posts was seen as essential for protecting peace in Northern Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement. But the future trading relationship between the UK and EU remains to be hammered out. After Britain leaves the bloc on January 31st, 2020, it will adhere to EU rules during a transition period until the end of the year. That means the risk of a no-deal hard Brexit remains if Britain and the EU cannot agree a new trade deal by the end of 2020. EU diplomats warn that's a process that normally takes several years.
Well, Barbara Weisel's still with us. Barbara, the debate over the UK and the EU has cost Conservative Prime Ministers their jobs. Is everyone on the same page now?
everyone in the Conservative Party is, and that is simply because all the other Tories, the ones who wanted to stay close to the European Union, maybe even stay in the European Union, they're all gone. During the bitter fight about Brexit in the course of last year, they all left the party, and then they sort of stood down, the majority of them, when the election came up. So this means you're looking at a completely different Conservative Party now. It has had a sharp shift to the right, and everybody at the moment is a Boris Johnson loyalist. There is nobody who would even say a word against him or his plans. So for him, it's all plain sailing. For the rest of Britain, the opposition has to rebuild itself, and for people who were naturally opposed to Brexit because they feel it limits their possibilities and their life within Europe, they just have to think whether they will continue fighting and how they want to lead this fight. Is it about the future relationship, or do they want to start opposing the government and Boris Johnson's plans? All this is yet completely open.
And let's talk about Brussels as well, because it's reacted to the vote with the new EU Council President, Charles Michel, describing it as an important step in clarifying London's relationship with Brussels. How much is this a relief for Europe?
There is, of course, the aspect of relief, because the fighting is finally over, the going in circles and running back and forth, and the insecurity that brings, and the insecurity that it has also brought to the EU, and the constant preoccupation with Britain. They want to think about other things. But on the other hand, everybody in Brussels knows that the bitter end is yet to come, because the negotiations about the future relationship, Boris Johnson has only left 11 months for those. Now, he can change that easily at any time. It looks like a ploy, some ploy that he's just using to blackmail the EU and giving him what he wants. But on the other hand, if it is just about a bare bone trade agreement that they're talking about, they might be able to hit the time limit, but they might also not be able to agree on anything. So that is still all up, and the European Union is not quite certain what next year will be holding.
Well, February 2020 looks to be the date to mark in the diary as the tricky one. Barbara Weisel, try and get some rest before then. Thanks a lot.